And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe to talk about um, the latest edition of our Rewrite a Novel in 60 Days challenge. Joining me today is Rick Partlow. Josh Hayes, Mayor. He's supposed to be here. We'll see.
Well,
Don't
he
know if
lives
he
in
had.
Kansas, and I understand that some tornado picked him up and delivered him to some place where he was
Yeah,
in
there's
color.
there's literally no telling when you're talking about Kansas. Anything can happen. How are you, Rick?
I'm doing well. I finished a book 2 days ago, so you
Which
know,
was that the latest Drop Trooper, or is this
no, this is
your
a new
other series?
series.
Okay. Is this first book in the series?
Yeah, it's the first one.
Yeah. What's the series about? What if what's your elevator pitch for this series?
Um, it's about a college student who is abducted by aliens from 1987 and spends 35 years in stasis on this alien zoo ship and then wakes up when they're attacked by pirates and has to work with other captives to save the ship and take it over and survive in this new star system way out there.
I love it. Where did the idea for that come from? Like,
I'll just
what are you the kind of person that you think of, like, just the what if and just think of ways to make this what if happen? Like what an oddball idea that when you start talking about it says, "Oh, I totally want to read that." How do you go from oddball idea to
I this is a series that I'm doing with Jeff Cheney.
okay,
So I brainstormed with him for the plot.
gotcha.
So
Um, nice. Do you see this as having series potential?
oh, it's definitely going to be a series. I have to write the first three books before he publishes the first one. So it's going to be at least three books, and probably a lot more. Hopefully,
Gotcha, gotcha. Um, how much time do you take between, like, you just wrapped that book? When are you going to start the next one, or have you?
now I started writing a short story in that universe. Actually, the same day I finished the book
Yeah,
because I'm kind of in that universe. So I just want to get done. The short story is going to be like a magnet type of thing, for marketing, and it's also going to be published with the first book. Um, After I finish the short story, I'm going to outline three other books, and then I'll start new series. I'll start Drop Trooper 13 at the beginning of April.
gotcha. Do you kind of build in off time between books when you're writing to give yourself a chance to do something different with your life, or to think about other things? Or do you even think in terms like that?
I I have some things scheduled, like I'm going to Yellowstone for 2 weeks in May,
Nice.
um, and we're gonna do a couple of things as a family. So I usually try to work the uh, the writing breaks to those. It's not like I schedule the writing and then schedule the vacation. It's more like the vacation scheduled. So let me see how I can get my writing in around that without. Because I have made the mistake before of having the vacation scheduled, and then I'm just starting the climax of a book, and I have to take 2 weeks off and can't write, and that's a nightmare. That's like, you get back and it takes forever to get back into the flow of the book. So I try to make sure that I schedule the writing so I finish something off before
Yeah.
I before I go, so I don't wind up caught in mid book.
Some people say, that they write every day, no matter where they are, Christmas, vacation, whatever. They take a laptop, and even if it's just a page, they get a page in, and that
Well,
flow never breaks. But it sounds like when you go on vacation, like when you go to Yellowstone, are you just out of writer mode?
it's not so much being out of writer mode as it is like when I go to Yellowstone. If I go for like a week in the fall, well, it gets dark early. It gets dark like 6 o'clock or something.
Yeah.
So you can go back to your hotel room and you have time to write. In the spring, it gets light at 5 in the morning and it gets dark at like 9:30 at night. And I'm on the road the whole time or hiking or whatever. So I get back, to the hotel room and
And
it's
you're
9:30 or
wiped
whatever.
out.
I'm wiped out. I just got to go to bed. I can't. I don't have the mental energy to write. I have tried before to write like at lunchtime. I'll stop the car, and try to write, but it's hard. It just can't get in the mindset. So it
Yeah.
usually the only thing that I am able to do when I go, and I go every spring, the only thing I'm able to do is do a little outlining, maybe.
Yeah. So, and this doesn't really have anything to do with plot other than um, just it's all integral to your process, and you are a plotter. So, um, what about your writing tools? Like, are you the kind of person that can take notes on his phone or open up um, a writing app like Dabble or something like that on your phone and write? Like if you're out in the wilderness and an idea pops in your head and you're like, oh God, I can't lose this. How would you go about capturing that idea?
Well, previously, I've always taken along a notebook
Yeah,
and I'll write it down. As I've gotten older, my handwriting has gotten worse, so it's
same.
harder and harder for me to read what I wrote down. So I've started. I take my phone and I will open up an app and write a note in my phone usually,
Gotcha. Um, do you do
or
you
I will record a note on my phone if I'm like driving. I'll just hit record button and
That's a great idea. Uh, do you ever get back home and start kinda gathering all the notes that you've taken? And, like, how do you then assimilate that into your current writing?
the way my mind works is usually if I write something down,
Yeah,
then I don't need to look at it again. If I don't write it down, then I'll forget it. But if I write it down, I actually take the time to write it down. Then when the time comes, I just remember it. That's just the way it works for me.
yeah, yeah. Um, in Can you define what plot means to you when you start thinking about, the plot of a book? What does that entail? Like, when you what do you consider as being the elements that make up plot?
Are you talking about what distinguishes plot from something else, or
Y
what the how I break down a plot?
well, let's start at the basic. What defines plot? What do you mean
Plot
when
is
you
what
say plot?
happens in a story. It's it's the beginning, middle, and end of a story. It's what's going to happen, as opposed to character or setting or things like that.
Right.
It's the actual events that are going to happen in the story.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because you start thinking of plot, character, setting as these completely separate things in a story, but when they all start working together in a story, there's a lot of bleed over between, character sort of feeds the plot, almost becomes plot because this character would only do things a certain way, and that informs the plot. Um, I've heard the saying "character is plot," and
Well,
that's
that depends on how you write, really. I mean,
yeah,
if you especially if you're a pantser, somebody who doesn't outline thoroughly,
yeah,
it may be that you want to let your characters take you to a different place to what makes more sense for the plot. But if you are more of a strict outliner, then the plot's going to guide the characters. It's going to guide the evolution of the characters rather than the other way around. And
yeah,
both are fun. I mean, both can work. Um, I've done it both ways. Um, on this last book that I just completed, that I was telling you about, I did something very different for me, just because it felt right. I followed an outline until about the 50,000 word mark, and then I looked at that outline and I said, you know, the last part of this book is not interesting. I thought it would be. I thought it could, because I tend to make the last part of the book, when I outline, I'd make it last part a little less specific, because
Yeah.
I want to let things that happen in the first part of the book dictate it. But this one just wasn't interesting. It wasn't going to be dramatic enough, so I just threw it out. And about 50,000 to 90,000, I just did all that by the seat of my pants and let the characters guide me.
So I'm glad you said that, because that's one thing I want to talk about. When you get to the end of the book, how do you determine whether your plot is doing what it's supposed to do? How do you look at the story and judge whether this has held up or not? Like, what criteria? Is it just a subjective feeling when I read this? I just don't get the excitement that I want to get.
Basically, I mean, whether you can tell or not, as is influenced a lot by how experienced you are
Yeah.
at doing this and how much you've written before, and to a great extent, how much you've read. Um, Because if you've read a lot of books in your genre, you're going to have a feeling like, am I building up to what I have outlined?
Yeah.
Is this build up going to lead to what I have already outlined, or does it feel like it's leading somewhere else? If it feels like it's leading somewhere else, I mean, you could either. I don't recommend doing what I did. I can get away with that because I've. This is my 61st book.
Right.
But if you're like on your first or second or third, you need to go back and rewrite that part of your outline. If it's not feeling like you're building up to what you intended, then just go back and rewrite the end of your book, the outline for the end of your book. Just give it a more give it a climax that fits more with the build up you've already done.
Um, Being this is your 61st book, compared to someone at the beginning of their writing career, do you start thinking in terms of, um, like, this plot didn't do it, it doesn't have a certain thing at the end. I can make up for that in the next book in the series, or I can use this perceived deficiency as a kind of jumping off point for maybe a whole new storyline that I can explore in another book? Or do you ever start thinking like that, this is something I can resolve in the series as opposed to fixing this chapter?
I try not to.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a couple of times where I did because it was necessary, but usually I try to make every book self-contained, in
Yeah.
that it brings up, plot points and has arcs, and you complete those in that book. And there's things you have to carry on to the next book in the series, but I don't like leaving unresolved plot points. You know, like if, for instance, here's something just as an example. My One of my series, Wholesale Slaughter, it's a 6 book series.
Right.
There is a relationship between uh, the one of the main characters and the other, male and female. And I was urged by somebody that I should make that unresolved at the end of the first book, and keep it like lingering for a couple of books. That it would be better for marketing purposes for people, the whole will they won't they thing. But I didn't feel like that was, I don't say right. I mean, because it's not right or wrong, but I didn't feel like it was my style, and I didn't feel like it fit with the characters in the book. That they
Yeah.
weren't those kind of people, and I, resolve that in the book, the first book, and their relationship grew as the books went on. But it was never a will they, won't they, or are they going to get together? Because it was obvious from the beginning that they were. That that was not something that I was going to do the whole Sam and Diane business with. So
I posted over at Storycraft Cafe this morning that we were gonna talk about this subject, and I said, um, I kind of used the metaphor of making a roux, in a stew and thickening that plot. And someone said in I think kind of a joking matter, what about thinning your plot? Which kind of got my wheels turning because we always think about plot in terms of whether the plot is getting thicker, but what if your plot is too thick? And you get to the end of the book and you're like, there's just way too much going on here. Like I have overwritten this book. First off, have you ever found yourself in a position where you've kind of overwritten? And if so, how do you start whittling that down?
um, I have never really gotten in that position. I don't believe. I mean, somebody else would
Yeah.
probably have to tell me after reading the book whether they thought it was. But um,
Yeah, that may not be something that you're a good judge of your own work. I don't know.
I have had there have been books that I've had that have been like later books in the series where you have plot points from books 1, 2, and 3 or whatever coming together in a different book, and it gets pretty thick. But by that point, you feel like people have invested enough in the series that they're not going to be daunted by having a little bit of more detail and a little more complicated scheming.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe in my early books there were some that I tried to make things too complicated at the end, where I took that stuff out.
Yeah.
But it's been a long time since I wrote those, so it's hard for me to remember if I at what point exactly I stopped trying to do that. But I think it is important though for people just starting that the end of the book be not, I don't want to say simple, but as easy to follow as possible. You
Yeah.
don't want to make, I mean, it's okay to have complications, but you don't want to make things so where they can't follow the resolution. There have been books that I've read where the resolution of the novel was so complicated and on so many fronts that I felt cheated. I felt like they skimped on the resolution. I'll give you an example. It's a great
Okay.
book. A lot of people love it. Uh, but oh, now I'm blanking on the title. Of course I am. It's that cyberpunk novel, a guy named Hero Protagonist. Uh, do you know which one I mean? It's by uh,
Is that the Neil Stevenson?
yes, it's from Snow Crash.
Snow
Snow
Crash,
Crash.
yes. I could see
Sorry,
the cover, but I
I
couldn't
kept I
see.
kept wanting to say Cryptonomicon, but that's not the same book.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not, no, but
but
similar, but not.
at the end of Snow Crash, there's like four different plot threads coming
Mhm.
together, and it felt a lot to me like he gave short shrift to a couple of them. That there should have been a denouement for one of them that didn't exist, and this guy who was like kind of a anti-hero, kind of antagonist
Yeah.
protagonist type, is left on the verge of death at the end of the book, and you don't find out what happens to him. He just gets taken away in an ambulance, and the female character who was, they had a big connection. She just like blows off. What happens to him, and you have no idea what goes on after that. And I was like, is there a part of this book missing?
Right. Or
So
was
that's
he thinking that this would have series potential and he would pick that
No, I
up
don't think
and
so. I think he just kind of blew it off. It feels like he didn't think it was that important, but reading the book, this is an important character. This is an important character arc for both of
right.
them, and then you just blew it off at the end. So you have to be careful that if you have a complicated um, series of plot arcs that are coming together at the end of your book, don't blow off the resolution of any of them. I mean, and if you wind up with a Return of the King movie style thing where you have all these endings, well, maybe you should rethink things. But if it's better to have all those endings than to blow off the resolution of your arcs, because you're going to cheat people if you do.
Do you think, speaking of that, do you think that readers' tastes change, and therefore storytelling has to change? For instance, when you talk about the Return of the King, and you have all of these storylines that kind of cap off, and they all get their resolution in one way or another, and some people, if you're writing a book now and handling it in that way, they may say, well, that's trite, you can't do it like that. But then you also can't do it like Neil Stevenson did and just have someone go off in an ambulance and never tell you what happened. Um, do
Well, I think it
do
definitely has changed since
Yeah,
Tolkien wrote. I mean, Tolkien, his writing style was even out of date for when he wrote the books,
mm,
but people loved the books because of all the attention, the details and the languages and the
right,
civilizations and the histories. But I mean, as far as actual writing style, his writing style was not I
modern
don't
for
say
the time.
appropriate. It's not a modern writing style for when he wrote the books in the fifth, I think it's the 40s or 50s.
Yeah,
So
40s when he was doing the heavy writing. Yeah,
yeah, so that I mean but Tolkien is the exception to a lot of rules because he basically created a genre,
right,
and but yeah, you writing styles do change. It used to be that like for instance, third person omniscient was a common writing style back in around the turn of the 20th century up till about the 1930s maybe.
right.
But that changed, and now nobody who wants to get published would think of doing a third person omniscient novel. At least not for anything except maybe a literary, some sort of highbrow literary thing that trying to make some kind of stylistic point. But if you're writing a Tom Clancy style thriller or a mystery novel or a science fiction or romance, whatever, nobody's going to write third person omniscient in anything except for some kind of literary experimentation. So definitely things definitely change. I think I think how we end books has changed to some extent. I mean, I feel like we've gone through several evolutions of expected endings. What audiences expect from an ending.
Yeah. Um, in
There was
plotting
a
out.
time like back in the 60s and
Yeah.
70s where a lot of endings were very very cryptic and uncertain and unfulfilling, which is why I hate a lot of books from the 70s. But
Well, we talked about that last week, that writing short stories, it's almost, um, not only is it okay to have an ambiguous ending, a lot of times it's kind of expected in short stories. Like we don't expect to have uh everything wrapped up in a bow at the end of it. Not necessarily. We're much more forgiving in a 10,000 word or less story to just, kind of, you know, unresolved at the end, but we will not put up with that in 120,000 word story. It's almost like the form dictates the writing style.
well, when I look back at all the short stories that I really liked, I don't know if I can think of too many that were unresolved at the
Yeah.
ending. So I don't know if I agree with that.
Okay.
I mean,
Well,
some people will accept it. I'm
yeah.
pretty much want some, doesn't have to resolve everything, but I want the main question of the story resolved.
Well,
Um,
yeah, yeah, and yeah, and I agree with you on that. But I guess what I'm saying is that in a short story, I like to be able to let this character live in my head a little bit. Like maybe they solved this particular problem, but maybe I learned just enough about this character that I want to spend more time with them, if that makes sense.
To some extent, I guess that
Yeah.
depends on the short story. I mean, some of them you're not going to spend any more time with that character because they're
Right.
dead.
True.
So,
True. Um, since you are a heavy plotter outliner, and that affords you the ability to not very often get to the end of a book and realize that the plot didn't work or the characters don't live up to expectations, because you have handled a lot of those questions in the very beginning before you do the majority of the writing work. Um, do you ever find yourself it when you're outlining, how often do you revise that outline when you get, like, you get to the end of it? Do you then kind of go back over that outline to see if the outline is living up to its potential, and how much work do you do once you've got a completed outline? How much editing do you do to that outline before the drafting starts?
well, what I do is probably not what most people are going to be able to get away
Okay.
with doing because, like I said, I've been doing it for a long time. But back in the
Sure.
beginning, when I was doing it, I did revise the endings of the outlines quite a bit. Uh, I would get to like the midpoint in the book, and I would say, there's a few things that need to be changed in this outline. This character doesn't feel like somebody who would do this, and I would go in and change the end of the outline and make the ending different. Make usually what I wound up doing most often was changing which characters did what. I knew what had to get done, but as the book progressed and characters evolved, I would say, no, this character isn't the one that should do this at the end. It's this character. So I would change like which character died and which character uh, made the heroic sacrifice or whatever, because it would feel like that feels natural now. As I've gone along, like 61 books in, I have kind of a feel for it, and it's not that I don't change things anymore.
Yeah.
It's that I don't have to write it down. I know it. I can just change it in my head. And honestly, as I was saying before, writing things down for me, I don't have a I don't have a photographic memory, but I have the kind of memory where once I write something down and go over it once or twice, it usually sticks. So I can just change the outline in my head and just work off that without going back and rewriting it. But that's after a long time in doing this. So if you're outlining and you feel like things aren't working, yes, definitely open up that outline, go in there and change whatever you have to.
You began your writing career as a pantser, and you've told us about how your um, writing, not only your writing production changed when you became a plotter, um, but also how your storytelling elevated when you adopted this um, style of writing that you do now. What was the hardest thing for you switching from pantsing to plotting? What was there? There had to be an obstacle that just felt like, it's like when I know for me, when I have shifted from more of a pantser view to a plotter, um, there's just um it just feels like work sometimes, and you
Well,
don't want to.
that's the big problem. That's the
Yeah.
big obstacle is that when I was pantsing, it felt like this was a hobby. It was
Yeah.
something I did for fun, and it was at the time. Just
Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to originally I wanted to get traditionally published, and that didn't work out. And so after that, when I started self-publishing, this did not seem like something I could make a living at. So I was just doing this for fun because a lot of people read the first book, and I'm like, well, I want to write something that they're going to enjoy. I wasn't thinking about marketing. I wasn't thinking about how it sold or series potential. I want to write something that the people like the first book will enjoy and something I enjoy writing. So mostly pantsing was a fun thing. And when I started outlining, it turned from that to kind of work, and that's something you have to get over.
Yeah.
And I can't I can't advise anybody on what's going to work for them, but for me, um, I was in a position where I had worked on mental discipline for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I was a long distance runner, and did triathlons and stuff and did martial arts. So I worked. I was not a very mentally disciplined person when I was younger, and it wasn't until I was in probably my early 40s that I got
Okay.
really mentally disciplined,
Yeah.
like late 30s, early 40s. Um, Not to say I didn't have discipline at all, but
Yeah.
mostly I responded to external pressure, like somebody else putting a deadline, somebody else telling me this is what I had to do. I didn't have that internal discipline to to really be a writer until I started doing all these things that brought me into, like, especially it's funny, but marathon, long distance running, training for marathons, that gives you a mental discipline that helps us so many other things. Um, when nobody is telling you you have to do something that's really really hard and somewhat unpleasant at first, um, it it teaches you a lesson on how to face things that have to be done. And I think being a parent helped with this too. There's things you have to do. You don't like them, uh, and you can either resent them
Yeah.
and hate them, or you can learn to embrace them and just know that there's something that has to be done and there's an outcome that you're working toward, and the outcome is worth the unpleasantness. Since it's being a parent, training for a marathon or a triathlon, or uh, training for your next belt in martial arts, you do a lot of stuff that's hard and sometimes unpleasant, and you don't feel like doing it. You get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, uh, to go for a 20-mile run, and you're like, oh man, I don't, I just want to go back to bed.
Yeah.
And then you got to convince yourself, well, let me just get up and get ready and see how I feel. And then you're like, well, I'll just start running. And if I feel like crap at the end of 3 or 4 miles, I'll just turn around and come back, or I'll just do 10 miles today or whatever. And then you wind up doing what you're going to do, because once you get so it's the same thing
Exactly.
with writing. Um, you write the outline, and even though it's not as fun as just sitting there and you know tapping away, and then, oh, that's not, I'll go back and this is, and taking a year to write a book, even though it's not the same kind of fun, and you don't wind up with the same sort of revelatory surprise when characters do things you didn't expect them to. It's rewarding. I mean, you finish a book and you still have that same uh, serotonin release reward of, I finished something really hard that most people never do. Just like running a
Right.
marathon, you finish a marathon and you're like, most people will never do this, you know. Um, and if you have the mental discipline, if you can keep up with it, it becomes a habit. It becomes a lifestyle.
Right.
Because once you do something often enough, even no matter how hard it is or how unpleasant it was to begin with, it becomes easier and easier because it becomes a lifestyle. It's like when you're a kid, uh, maybe brushing your teeth and flossing seem like torture. You don't want to do it, but you do it when you start doing it when you're a little kid, and then by the time you're in school, it's just something you do.
Right.
You don't think about it anymore. Well, it's the same
Right.
thing with writing. If you keep writing, this many words a day, and you keep outlining and following that outline and just putting the stuff on paper, whether or not it feels inspired, eventually it's going to become a lifestyle, not even a habit. It's going to become something you just do. And you won't be sitting there thinking, oh, I just don't feel like writing today, any more than you'd be sitting there thinking, oh, I don't feel like going into work today. I don't care. I'm gonna
Yeah.
take the next week off and
Yeah.
get fired.
Yeah, the
That's
mortgage still has to be paid.
Yeah. That's the other thing. I mean, that's something that wasn't a pressure for me at first because I wasn't a full time writer. And even when I became a full time writer, my wife is a pharmacist. So if I failed, you know, if I didn't accomplish what I was trying to accomplish, we always had a safety net. We
Yeah.
weren't going to starve. We weren't going to lose the house because she made a good amount of money. And it took a long time before I finally said, I'm at the point where this is what I do and I can make a living at it.
I love it. And I said, this is exactly how I tricked myself to writing too. Oh, just do 200 words, et cetera, et cetera. Then I have 1,000 words. And Anna, you're absolutely right. If you know, getting up and just committing to a little bit of something, and then normally most people, once you're doing the thing, I mean, you might as well finish what you set out to do. It's why get up and put forth all this effort and then just pull out of it. Um, I have a little different take on that. And uh, although I 100% agree with everything you said, Rick, there's a great documentary film. It's called "It Might Get Loud." I think it's the title, and it's three guitarists from different generations: Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, The Edge from U2, and Jack White from the White Stripes and the Raccoon Tours and uh, 100 other bands that he's participated with. But they're kind of telling their stories of how they became musicians and how they approached the instrument and all these different things. But Jack White um talks about um he's talking while he's fashioning a one string guitar out of a 2x4 and a Coke bottle and a piece of metal wire, and he's building this thing, and he puts an electric guitar pickup on it, and then he's playing like slide guitar out of this thing that he just built, and he's making music out of it. And he talks about how um in the Bible, in the beginning, when God tells Adam that man has to toil, from the ground and to make things, and that'll be kind of part of human nature, that we work at something. And he likened that to his musical career, and he said some people want to buy a $1,000 Gibson Les Paul that's in perfect shape, and all this, and it he said, but he likes to go to pawn shops and get a guitar that's kind of, the neck is twisted, and it's you won't stay in tune, and have to work at making something out of it. He said something special comes out of the toil, out of the imperfection of this instrument, and me making something creative out of the imperfections becomes something different.
Yeah.
And if everything is just glorious in your writing day in and day out, wonderful, but it's those times where it is hard that a lot of times something really great comes out of that. Have you ever experienced something like that where you had to really, really work at it, and on the other side of it, like something, better than you comes out of it almost?
Um, when I was when I was when I was pantsing,
Yeah.
that happened a lot. I mean, there were times when there were times like when I was taking a year to write a book. That was because there were times where for 2 or 3 weeks I would be stuck on a plot point, and not knowing where to go next, and everything I thought of and tried didn't seem to work, and that forced me to come up with something, innovative and something that that wound up being really cool. And that was one of the perks of doing it that way, was that you had so much time to let things percolate and ruminate in your mind, that whatever came out, really fit what you've been working on. Um, since I started outlining, um, usually that kind of um, sticking point,
Hmm.
the hard point, that comes in the outlining phase, and sometimes that'll take a while. Like sometimes I can write an outline in 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
But sometimes it'll take 2 weeks, and the reason it take 2 weeks isn't because the book's longer. It's because I get to something and I'm like, what can happen next? How do I bring this all together? But that's the thing with outlining. You can do that in the 2 to 3 weeks, when you're outlining, and then go right through the book. Whereas the other way around, you stop writing for 2 or 3 weeks.
What do you do when you reach one of those points where it's tough and you can't figure out where to take the plot? Do you have you developed little habits that, like, when you recognize when you've run up on a thing like that and you go do yard work, or like, is there a thing that you have recognized as, this is the thing I do when I need to think through something?
um, there's no one thing I do. I tend to think about it no matter what I'm doing, and just, but it does help to get away from the keyboard and just like go to the gym or go for a walk or go outside and do yard work. Something that doesn't require my brain to work on something else or to think about anything else, where I can just let it kind of, you know, float free, in the ether, and see if anything comes out. Um, but mostly the way that I get around those bottlenecks
Yeah,
is I will just either take out a pen or get on the keyboard, and I'll write like little bullet points, and like have like 10 different ideas of where things could go. And I'll just write, this is one way that could happen, this is another way, this is another way. And by the time I get usually to like the third or fourth, I really don't even have to I'll write more sometimes just to make sure I'm not overlooking anything. But usually it's like the third or fourth one that I try that winds up being the answer.
interesting. Do, does setting affect your plot? Have you ever, like, maybe had an outlining session where it just doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, or not going where you hoped it would go, but then change a setting and then all of a sudden the plot opens up?
Not that I can remember, because usually I'm the kind of person who, when I was younger,
Hmm.
I just filled notebooks full of background information,
Yeah,
settings, histories, things like that. So usually for me, the setting is just the setting.
yeah,
There's not a lot. There's a few times where I will go back and adjust some minor detail, but usually for me, the setting is kind of like the canvas I'm painting on. And if I throw away that canvas, then it's pretty much a whole new painting, you
yeah.
know?
Well, and do you
Because I
find?
kind of I kind of like the setting. I kind of
Yeah,
like that's like the hobbyist, fanboy, nerd part of me is the one that likes making all the settings,
right.
and the work is, the story. That's the craft and everything. But the setting is where I get to just play, and
Yeah.
make up something that was fun.
Well, I guess at the heart of it, um, all stories are stories of human interaction at some point, and whether that's set on the bridge of a
Or
spaceship.
sentient interaction.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's qualify that. Or it's, takes place on a Caribbean island. The tension is always how these characters interact. So, I guess in that way, um, setting is sort of irrelevant, or if not irrelevant, is maybe seasoning in the gumbo, um, because the real plot is what these characters are doing with each other in a
Well,
lot of ways.
setting affects the what's the word I'm looking for? It's not confrontation, conflict. Setting affects the conflict.
Yeah,
The nature of the conflict is going to depend on the setting. But the people are always going to react and behave like people, because even though that may not be true in reality, if it's 1,000 years from now and our civilization is so different and we think so different that we don't think the same way, but the people who are reading your book all think like 21st century, mostly Americans, mostly Westerners. So you have to write a
right.
book where the characters interact in a way that the readers can understand. But the setting is something that makes the nature of the conflict. Like, if are you conflicted over uh, whether or not to recognize artificial intelligence as free individual people? Is that your conflict, or is it, in your Caribbean island, you conflicted because one guy wants to fish in this cove and you don't want to let him?
Last time we talked a little bit about torturing our characters, and um, do you ever like, is it ever your goal to have your characters all live happily ever after? Like, what part of character conflict drives story for you? How important is kind of moving that carrot farther out so that your characters are always grasping at something they can't have?
Well, my goal for my main character is not to live happily ever after as much as it is to fulfill their destiny.
Right.
And whatever their destiny is, not necessarily a destiny that's imposed on them from outside, but what their potential is to become the best they can be. Like, let's just take, for example, again, wholesale slaughter, because I was thinking about before.
Yeah.
Um, the main character, Logan, is he's in a position where he has his father, who's basically the king. They call him something else, but the guardian, but he's the king.
Yeah.
He has his best friend, he has his girlfriend, he has his brother, he has his superior officer, who's like a father figure, and he has this female ranger who has been like an aunt to him because his mother died when he was younger. He has all the support network around him, right? So if he is going to become the best leader and military officer and person he can be, and an adult, he needs all that support network stripped away from him so he can be the one supporting other people, so he can be standing on his own.
Right.
Because if he's got all these people he can use as a crutch, then he's not going to be the best leader. So when I kill off his father, and when I kill off, the female ranger who's like his aunt, and when I kill off his best friend, and when I make the guy who the officer who's like a father figure, when I pit them against each other, and they have different philosophies and wind up on different sides, that's not because I'm torturing him. It's because he needs to stand on his own 2 feet and live up to his potential and become a leader on his own. So I don't consider. It may feel torturous to the if you were the character losing
Right.
all these people, but it's to maximize, and there's a word for that I can't think of. It's like when you maximize your potential. It's a realization. I can't think of it,
Yeah.
but you know what I'm saying. It's
Yeah.
you have to become the best you can be, and when you're in a position where you're young and you have this all support network, well, a lot of people never don't become adults, and really, until their parents aren't there anymore.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and you don't have anybody to fall back on. That's
Exactly.
that's when you become an adult. It's when you become the patriarch or matriarch. It's when you become the one people depend on. So you have to strip away the support network in order for them to become the best they can be. And I don't I am not of the opinion, like some authors seem to be, that if things are getting boring, I'll just kill off another one of his loved ones, and get
Right.
make him go through pain. But you know, if because I feel like that's just cheating the reader. If you're, it's like it's a George R. Martin thing. The reason I never got past his first book was because any character that you care about is going to die. Well, if that's the case, then why would I keep reading? I mean, I know it's very successful, so people must enjoy it. But for me, I'm like, I have no reason to keep reading. If I care about a character, I mean, some of them might die, but the idea that all of them are going to die and
Yeah.
that none of them are going to have any realized potential, it's not something I want to read. I mean, maybe other people do. Maybe I've become a multimillionaire like George R. R. Martin if I did it that way. But I just can't write those books. The character has to have some kind of, I don't say destiny, but some kind of realized potential where they do something meaningful.
Yeah.
Actualize is the word I was looking for. By the
Actualize.
actualize,
Yes.
they
Yes.
become
Yes.
actualized by stripping away their crutches, their
Yeah.
mental and emotional crutches.
Well,
So
that's a
I don't want to torture them though. I feel like that's a cheap and easy and lazy way to write.
yeah. Well, and maybe that's a discussion we need to have another day. Nihilism versus, I don't know, but the author's worldview and how that plays into how you craft a story and how you treat your characters. Because in a world where it seems like nothing matters, like in George R. R. Martin's world, and anybody can just die, and
Mm.
it everything seems futile. I guess.
You say futile or feudal?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Both.
Sometimes the feudal nature is futile. But oh man, well that's gonna wrap up our discussion of plot today. Next week, hopefully Josh will be back, and we're also gonna have a special guest. Richard Fox is gonna join us, and we're gonna discuss writing in a series. And
We'll find out what does the fox say.
yeah, I have an idea what the fox says. Rick, always a pleasure to hang out. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.